Mesdames et messieurs, bonsoir. C'est avec beaucoup de plaisir que je vous souhaite la bienvenue au Centre d'études en politique internationale à l'Université d'Ottawa et au territoire traditionnel du peuple algonquin. Je m'appelle Rita Abrahamsen et je suis la directrice du CIPS. We pay respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region, from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. This evening's event is the second in a series that we have called Voting for a Better World, Foreign Policy in the 2019 elections. And I have to say that I don't think we could have timed it much better, given that we've just learned that the campaign will officially begin tomorrow. The inspiration for the series comes from the assumption that foreign policy does not matter in elections, and that the general voting public, which I think is us, do not really care about foreign policy, unless there is some kind of immediate threat to our welfare and our security. Against this very common belief, we want to say foreign policy does matter, and we ignore the relevance of international affairs to domestic politics at our peril. I think this has always been the case, but it is probably more so in this election than ever before. When we as Canadians go to vote in a few weeks, we will do so in an international climate of rapid change and uncertainty for Canada and for the world. And I think most foremost on our minds is always the new regime to the south, our neighbour to the south, and the way in which an America First policy and a new isolationism has a lot of impact for Canada. And we have to recognize that for better or for worse, the US has been the main defender of the liberal world order as we've known it since the Second World War. But it's not only the changes south of the border. At the same time as the US is retreating, we are witnessing a rising China and a resurgent Russia. And both China and Russia are becoming increasingly expansionists in terms of their ideologies and in terms of their geopolitics, openly and covertly. And we have probably all read about President Putin triumphantly declaring that liberalism has outlived its purpose, or it's obsolete, as he says, which is his way of celebrating the rise of nationalist populism in Europe and across the world. As a result of all these various changes, we are witnessing a world where the international trade regime is under threat, where multiple arms treaties are unraveling, and where, I think it's safe to say, democracy and human rights are on the retreat in country after country. All those changes, Canadians, we're not immune from them. It affects us, might affect us, our economy, our security, our environment, and so forth. So all this is to say that we do need to think about foreign policy. We do need to talk about foreign policy in the election. And this is what we are aiming to do at CIPS with this series of events. We began in the summer. We missed out on a great event in June if you were not there. But it's not too late. We have 4 events now, every week coming up. This is the first debate, where we begin to unpack some of the big geopolitical issues that will confront whatever government forms after the election in October. And I am extremely pleased that we have managed to assemble such a fantastic panel to take us away on the first debate. So I am going to introduce our panel relatively briefly. They are all so distinguished that I could take a lot of time doing so I hope you all forgive me for being brief. I will begin in alphabetical order. Brian Bowe is a professor of political science and director of the Center for the Study of Security and Development at Dalhousie University. He is the editor-in-chief of International Journal, which of course is the journal that publishes a lot of the main articles on Canadian foreign policy. And he is himself a well-known and frequent commentator on Canadian foreign policy and Canada-US relations. So welcome, Brian. Thank you for escaping Halifax and the hurricane to come and see us in Ottawa. It's raining here, but it is not nearly as bad. Thank you. Daniel Jean is a senior fellow. He's just joined us as a senior fellow in the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs here at the University of Ottawa. And he is the former National Security Advisor to Prime Minister Trudeau. Before that, from 2016 to 2018, he served as National Security and Intelligence Advisor to the Prime Minister, and from 2013 to 2016, he was Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs. So altogether, he has more than 35 years' experience in the Federal Public Service. Welcome. Pascal Mazot is a professor in the School of Political Studies here at the University of Ottawa, and she's an expert on China, the global political economy of China's rise, and Canada-China relations, so something that is very pertinent to the current situation. From 2015 to 2017, she was on leave from the university, serving as Senior Policy Advisor to the Minister of International Trade and Policy Advisor to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, covering the Asia-Pacific region. To my, what is that, right? To my right is Roland Paris, who is a professor in the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. He is an expert on international security, on peace building, and Canadian foreign policy. He was also a senior advisor to the Prime Minister, this time on global affairs and defense. And he is, as many of you will know, a frequent commentator on Canadian issues in the national and the international media. He is also, I must add, the founding director of CIPS, so he has a special status whenever we have a CIPS event. So the way this will unfold is as follows. I have asked the panelists to prepare about 5 minutes or so of the most pressing, urgent issues as they see it that are facing Canada, that we should think about as voters, and possibly what might the next government do about those things. We will then have a brief conversation up here, and then we will open it up for your questions and comments and aim for a bit of a dialogue. I will aim to finish around 7:30. So that's the game plan. We have also agreed that the first person to start us off is Daniel Jean, and we will actually go this way. So, Daniel, please.
Merci beaucoup, Rita. Merci pour l'invitation. I'm happy to be among this distinguished panel, and I hope you're going to give me the chance of the beginner, because I'm not used to academic panels, and I'm really coming as the modest, retired public servant practitioner. As the initial panelist, what I'm going to try to summarize in a few minutes is my observations on the current state of the international scene and what this means for Canada. So let's look at this international scene. We see a China that is more and more assertive, and beyond its own geopolitical way, having taken advantage of global trade liberalization, has converted itself into global economic power, and is not shy in using this geo-economic power to exercise influence. We see it in its region through the Belt and Road Initiative. We've seen it in other regions. We have our own issues, as you know right now. So many experts now refer to the geo-economic weight of China as a new phenomenon. We observe a Russia where Vladimir Putin, I think, has been very skillful at converting what was a humiliation sentiment that Russians had on how they were treated following the Iron Curtain fall towards the West, in a very strong nationalism at home and a troublemaker attitude abroad, where Russia practices what I'd like to call a disruptive foreign policy. They're very happy to steer trouble and not own the problem or any of its consequences. We see regional tensions. Just think about Saudi Arabia and their Gulf allies versus Iran, that fuel the risk of proxy wars like what's happening in Yemen, and the risk of nuclear proliferation on top of existing concerns that we have with the North Korean program. More and more countries, particularly in Africa, do not control their entire territory. Let's think about Nigeria and Mali. And others have been the theater of extremist insurrections, Iraq, Syria, and Libya. In parallel to those, as Rita has mentioned, we observe some fatigue and withdrawal from great powers as stabilization agents, those who would promote good behaviors and attempt to deter bad ones through the adoption, compliance of established and adhere international norms. You have the United States withdrawing from its traditional role of sheriff of the international order, and through reinvigorated protectionism, because there's always been trends of protectionisms in the US as in many countries, but through reinvigorated tourism is certainly affecting the international economic order. You have UK and France, which while well-intentioned, are distracted by, from engaging even further by pressing domestic and European challenges. You just think about the discontent in France and the Brexit issue between France and between the UK and the EU. You have Germany, who in my view, during my time as Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs and early days of National Security Advisor, was probably one of the most active and more effective leader in Europe in terms of working towards better norms, who's also distracted by our own domestic situation and challenges to social cohesion. The European Union could have probably filled some of the vacuum, as unfortunately on top of Brexit, seeing its ability to adopt common positions, common norms and all that challenge following the mass migration crisis. So what about Canada in this mix? Enough talking about others' challenge, but what about ourselves? In the context of international affairs, Canada's middle power has usually shined, experienced its best moment in pursuing both prosperity and security through its contribution to strong multilateral organizations, as much by its innovative ideas at times, than by its reputation of honest broker. As people in South America used to tell us, you have no baggage. We've seen this in the past with peacekeeping at the UN and trade liberalization work at the WTO, and more recently in efforts to promote better opportunities for women and children in developing countries, or in the economic sphere, the leadership that we played in the G20 following the 2008 economic and financial crisis. It's quite clear that despite the best of intentions, it's far more difficult for Canada to play this niche role at the time where the action of most multilateral actors, both political and economic, is stalled. Or in some instances, as Rita said, if you look at the nuclear front, regressing. Yet, the best way to deal with China is to have a more closely knitted solidarity among actors, whether geopolitical or economic. In the same way, if we want to respond to some of the misbehaviors by Russia, there's nothing better than being able to be unified in our actions. So while I'll let my colleagues throughout the panel develop further what Canada should do, I think that Canada needs to rally coalitions of the willing on various aspects to create the momentum for change. The last two governments have had some success doing so. For example, when confronted with a stalled multilateral track on the trade front, they've pursued regional and bilateral instruments that can enhance prosperity and security. I'll give you an example. I think that Canada enhancing its relationship with Japan and other ASEAN states following the adoption of the CPTPP is crucial in offering ASEAN states an alternative to China. And I can tell you that once the CPTPP was adopted, Japan was very happy to talk to Canada and other countries about how we can be more present in the region, indeed, to be able to promote better behaviors when to deal with China or other countries. Closer to home, I think that the leadership that Canada is deploying towards the sad state of affairs in Venezuela is crucial to enhance our relationship with South America and the Caribbean states, and is welcomed by our important neighbor, the United States. With regards to multilateral institutions, whether the UN or the WTO, I think we need to work very hard with like-minded to try to create this momentum for reform. But I will let my fellow panelists entertain you further on how Canada could do more in this challenging world.
feel like you've handed the baton to me, but I might run in a different direction, actually. But first of all, thank you so much for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to be part of this discussion. And I appreciate the structure that we're starting off with very brief remarks. It's really about a discussion amongst ourselves and also involving the audience. Let me thank everybody for coming out here tonight. It's great to see friends and colleagues and students and former students. So welcome back to the university. My first point will be that we can have a bit of a discussion tonight about some of the changes that are taking place, some of the changes taking place in the world and how they affect Canada and how we could think about how Canada should be responding to these new conditions. But the scope of the changes, the extent of the changes are such that I think that the next government, whoever is elected, should begin by beginning a foreign policy review of one kind or another. And I have some ideas of the type of foreign policy review that should be considered, and it wouldn't be the typical version. And it's just that the conditions are such that it really requires a deep dive, a deeper dive than any of our parties have the capacity, in-house capacity to do, and a deeper dive that shouldn't just be done by our very capable but somewhat cloistered Foreign Service. It needs to be a broader discussion than that. Having said that, let me just give you a little kind of sampler dish. And my sampler dish of concerns and priorities is really just, it's really not a very exciting, it's kind of prosaic, not very exciting. It's bread and butter, a few bread and butter issues. Our foreign policy is much bigger than the few areas I'm going to mention, but these are in some ways essential and we have to get them right. And the environment has changed profoundly. We're not used to a US president who sometimes treats his allies, American allies, worse than America's adversaries. We're not used to being targeted by the type of pressure tactics that China has leveled against us. We're not used to having Canada be a proxy battlefield in what is an essentially major power competition, emerging trade war, with outside powers trying to score points against each other at our expense. And whatever you might think about the wisdom of the now infamous tweet that provoked Saudi Arabia's ire last year, the fact that none of our allies, not one of our allies, spoke up in Canada's defense when the Saudi regime targeted this country for retaliation, well, that was also a wake-up call. So what do we do about it? Well, how do we respond to these new environment? Let me identify three core requirements, and I think that this is a good way to start such a discussion myself. This is where I would start. What are the core requirements of the foreign policy, and how has the changing environment changed the way in which we might seek to accomplish it? The first won't surprise you at all. It's ensuring that we have an effective relationship with our southern neighbor. Maintaining a good working relationship with the United States and a reliably open border is as close to an existential interest in our foreign policy as there is. It is fundamentally important to the well-being of our economy and our people. We dodged a bullet with NAFTA over the last few years, and it could have gone a different way. We also need to recognize that this is a longer-term challenge. Donald Trump, at some point sooner or later, will cease to be president of the United States. But the forces that brought him to power will endure, most likely, as powerful forces within the US body politic for some time to come. We have some advantages, Canada. We have always had certain advantages. We care more about the relationship than the United States does. And therefore, we are motivated to be more mobilized than the Americans are in the relationship. And we've been very good at outreach and managing through all levels of the US political system. During these recent NAFTA negotiations, what you saw was a more extensive and coordinated and far-reaching advocacy campaign than I think that Canada has ever conducted over such an extended period of time. And we've been pretty good about this in the past. I'm looking at John Curtis, he knows all about this. This, though, is not just about the emergency of renegotiating NAFTA. This level of, or something approaching this level of sophisticated and intense advocacy needs to be part of the new normal of our relationship with the United States. It is just, the stakes are just too huge and the uncertainties are too great. And that means the machinery and the resources to be able to continue that kind of adversary rather than allowing the machinery to slip when the urgency of the moment passes. Secondly, access to other foreign markets, again for reasons of core economic interests. In some ways, this is the flip side of dealing with the United States. You know, diversifying trade, our trade minister is also called the Minister of Trade Diversification, has been a theme since the 1970s. You know, it was Trudeau's father and his third option that really brought this to the fore. And in some ways, it's a pipe dream. We're never going to really not be dependent on the United States, given the geographical and economic realities. But it is real in the sense that ours is an export-driven economy, at least in large, we're more dependent on trade than others. And we need to be doing a better job of accessing fast-growing markets in particular. Now, both conservative and liberal governments, you see how unpartisan I'm being here, let me put on this. Both conservative and liberal governments can take credit for negotiating and concluding the CETA and TPP, but there's a lot more work to be done, and it's not just about the trade deals. It's about what happens after you negotiate the trade deals. It's about whether Canadian companies take advantage of the opportunities that trade deals create for them. And we need to be thinking about how to encourage and help our, especially small and medium-sized enterprises, to be able to access those markets, because they don't necessarily have the habits of doing so. Finally, what Danielle mentioned is the famous rules-based international order, or that broad network of alliances and institutions and rules that has underpinned a broadly open and broadly stable world order for the past several decades. And here, we need to be realistic, we need to be smart, we need to be selective. The order is under great strain. It is undergoing changes. This is not just a kind of rearguard action to hold on to what we have. We need to be thinking about what elements of that order are especially important, and also how to adapt it to new power realities in the world and new actors. I wrote a piece on this subject for Chatham House called "Can Middle Powers Save the Liberal World Order?" ? And the answer is no, they can't do it on their own, but they can sure slow the decay, at least for a time. But they have to do so in a way that's very deliberate and that is targeting specific areas and where we're working together more closely than we have before. The work between the cooperation between a number of countries on the WTO has been very encouraging. The WTO is in terrible straits right now, but the Ottawa group discussing ways of dealing with the kind of paralysis that now affects the WTO, and even the emergence, the development of a parallel appellate body by the EU and Canada together. These are the kinds of things that really can potentially be helpful. And beyond that, there are areas where Canada can make a really significant contribution, even if they're not as directly related to our core interests. I've mentioned many, many times as an example that Canada could, if it wanted to, lead an initiative to a broad-based initiative to provide quality primary education to refugee children, to the millions of children that are stuck in protracted refugee situations who aren't being resettled. It's a time bomb of hopelessness. It's a development issue. It's a security issue. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you for being here. I'll delve just a little bit deeper into the China issue, as opposed to taking a broader look of our foreign policy challenges and dilemmas. What I would say first is, yes, foreign policy has not been traditionally a major issue in electoral campaigns in Canada. Neither has China, even less so. I don't think China ever was an electoral issue. There is some chance that this time around is the first time that China is actually more present, maybe not as a deciding factor, but quite present on the electoral campaign. trail. The second thing I would say, just to preface my short remarks, is that there's one piece of relatively good news that we've heard over the past few days, is the nomination of our ambassador to China, Vladimir Putin. It's quite unexpected. Most experts, me included, didn't think it was likely we were going to get an ambassador before the elections. And so it is relatively good news, and I'm happy to say more about why I think that is. But it remains that we're in the most difficult spot in our relationship ever since the creation, since the establishment of our relationship in 1970. And at the same time as this is happening, I think Roland and Daniel have set the stage well. The US-China trade conflict is deepening in the background, and I do think that we have passed a qualitative threshold. No matter what happens in the next election or the next elections after that, we there's no going back to where we were 3 years ago. But I would say, though, that the end point is still uncertain, and behaving as if the worst case scenario was the most likely scenario will actually lead us there. And we might not necessarily need to go there. I think that there's a strong likelihood that we end up muddling through for quite some time. At the same time as these changes are happening at our doorstep, we've entered an era of multipolar, multi-level, complicated global governance. And I think that one of the effects of this is that our deeply held principles, our foreign policy priorities, our interests at the global level will not overlap anymore with a definite particular set of countries that we used to call like-mindeds, that we still call like-mindeds. And so I think that one of the things we have to do is that we have to be a little bit nimbler and accept that there's no permanent coalition of like-mindeds anymore across issue areas. And what it means for us and China is that we are going to have to be able to conceive of ourselves as being aligned with China on certain issues and not aligned on others. Strongly disaligned on some and quite strongly aligned on others. In turn, it means that we must transform our approach to China from an on-off switch into what I've called an adaptive modular relationship, where we can modulate our relationship across issue areas. Now, this does not mean a transactional approach or ad hoc approach. In fact, it can mean the opposite. It is strategic and deeply principled to closely work with China on climate change. In fact, deciding to work on climate change is the primary decision point. Working with China follows that. The same thing with supporting multilateralism is also a primary policy choice. And it can lead in some circumstances to Canadian policy not aligning with the US. Not most of the time, but some of the time. And in fact, I would argue, perhaps controversially, that we have to channel some of the pragmatism and skill that Roland has pointed to, that we have deployed so successfully in our relationship with the US to our relationship with China. And I would actually say that some of the machinery that Roland described that was so effective, we have zero capacity in deploying that with our relationship with China, and we have to develop that more so than we have now. So still, the Chinese government will continue to do things that we profoundly disagree with. And we have to develop ways to deal with this so that we're not thrown into an existential crisis every time this happens. So our usual binary responses are inadequate. And as a note here, I would say that for those of us who have become wary of the word engagement, especially since last December, I would continue to say that engagement rationales are not predicated on a likability heuristic. The motivation to have a relationship and a strong relationship with China is not predicated on a likability heuristic, on rapid political liberalization, or on socioeconomic liberalization either. So what do we do then when we profoundly disagree with the Chinese government on things. I have developed a 4-category answer of behaviors that, in trying to think about this, to go beyond the binary into 4 categories. So, of course, there are issues where I think that Chinese behavior is unacceptable and it has a direct impact on Canadian interests. There, I think that we have to stand firm. This includes cases of commercial espionage or consular or interference. We have to be unapologetic, firm, I would say with precision and measure, though, and with a sense of resonance, but perhaps more so than we have in the past. And this will include strengthening Canadian institutions linked to the exercise of democracy, best practices in all sorts of areas, including academic freedoms. Since we are on a university campus, thinking about principles such as the University of Chicago principles on freedom of expression, for example. So a second category of issues I think we have to reflect on as Canadians is that some of us have had an impulse to react on a whole range of issues that I think belong to the Chinese people to decide on. And I call this category let go. And so there's a range of issues where I think Chinese people are the legitimate stakeholder and they have agency on. There's another category of issues where I think we must cooperate. So this includes global health, this includes climate change, it includes macroeconomic policy coordination in the event of a financial crisis, which we're just about due right now. China will need to be one of the main stakeholders at the table and will need to be there too. And then there's a 4th category of issues where I think that go beyond the strict confines of our bilateral relationship. And I call this approach, the approach that I think we should adopt, challenge and engage. And what I mean by this is those instances where Chinese behavior, Chinese government behavior crosses the line into gross violations either of internationally recognized human rights or international conventions such as the Vienna Convention. Canada can achieve more in collaboration with other partners and at the global level, multilaterally. The goal here, however, continues to be to engage China with the ultimate aim to engage it rather than isolate it. And so I think that problems arise when there's a mismatch between our responses to China and the levels at which it is behaving, which I've tried to deal with in the past couple minutes. And I'll close on this, and I'm happy to discuss this further, but for any of this to become feasible, we need to raise Asia and China literacy across the board, and we're in a great place to start. Thanks.
Last but not least.
Right. Okay. Cool. Okay. Start off by saying thank you to Rita and to CIPS for the invitation. I'm very happy to, as was hinted earlier, to escape from Halifax. It was actually kind of, I wasn't a near miss because there were a couple of days between the storm and my flying out here, but I do remember actually thinking on Saturday, looking out the front window, and there were literally like 3 trees down across the road right in front of the house, and I said, no, I'm not going to make it. So a lot of real estate has already been covered, and it's hard to know exactly what to talk about, but I think I want to mostly pick up on themes that Roland has already kind of gone through and kind of comb over some of that ground again to make a somewhat specific argument, which I will confess I literally just made up while I was listening to the other side. So my starting point is the theme or the idea of searching for counterweights, which Roland hinted at earlier and brought up Pierre Trudeau's government back in the 1970s, and that was another time in the past where the U.S. seemed to be going in a direction we were not happy with, and Canadians were anxious about how tightly we were tied to the United States. And one of the reactions to that was this idea of how do we, if not actually cut the rope to the US, find a way to loosen it? And how can we get some leverage in our relationship with the United States? And then there was this sort of casting about to find new partners and new ways of relating to those partners and new ways of getting some leverage or some advantage from those new relationships or intensified relationships, but also some leverage out of those relationships in our dealings with the US. And then that essentially came to nothing. And then there was a kind of a lesson learned in Canada about, okay, the counterweights thing doesn't work. And it was sort of brought back to us again in the free trade negotiations with the US in the mid and late 1980s. The question sort of came back again, do we really want to kind of jump with both feet into bed with the US sort of permanently, and what are the implications of that? And there were some people who said, no, we should keep one foot on the floor, or whatever metaphor you want to use. And again, that argument lost, both in the sense that the free trade agreement was sort of done and ratified, but also sort of it lost in sort of the court of public opinion. And there were a lot of people who sere of like, we already figured this out, it doesn't work, we just have to get in with the US and we have to figure out how to manage the relationship that way. And one of the things that's quite striking is that we have now returned to another time where the US seems to be heading in a direction we're not comfortable with, and you would expect that there would be at least some effort to kind of bring back. Do we want to, is there a way for us to kind of either get more leverage on the US or get some new partners that we can deal with? Is there some sort of new version of the counterweights argument that we want to explore? And of course, looking around, we're not seeing that happen. Nobody's really making that argument. Nobody's sort of in a search for that, except to the extent that people are talking about it, again, as something Roland brought up earlier, what are the ways that we can cooperate with other traditional partners to try to maintain as much of the liberal international order as possible as a sort of waiting strategy until Trump is gone and the temple can be rebuilt. And that is obviously an important thing, but I want to kind of connect that up to sort of the premise for this whole panel, which is the whole question of, how much of a role is foreign policy going to make in the election, or what kind of role is it going to have in the election, what kind of profile is it going to have, how are we going to talk about it. And I would say that the counterweights issue is not going to come up, and there isn't going to be much of a debate about big sort of philosophical, existential questions in the debate. This is my guesswork here. And I think that's partly because we never do, but more particularly this time, in spite of the fact that, as Roland said, we need a review because things are changing really quickly and in very complicated ways. There's a lot of uncertainty about the future. We ought to be talking a lot about foreign policy, but we're not going to, and I think that has a lot to do with very kind of mundane questions about how this particular election is going to work out. The Conservatives are going to pick at the Liberal government on sort of competency criterion rather than a big philosophical challenge where they so we have a different vision of our position in the world and we want to put that forward as a kind of campaign element. It's much more likely they're going to say, oh, you screwed this up and you screwed that up, but we'll do a better job of managing this, and they're not likely to sort of mount that larger challenge. I suppose Bernier's People's Party mounted something more like a philosophical challenge, but it's obviously not going to get much traction. And then presumably the NDP is out there to make that larger philosophical challenge in the way that they usually do, but they seem to be obviously struggling even before the election gets going, and there's a lot of question about what kind of traction they're going to have in those debates. So given that, I'm kind of skeptical about the idea that a lot of the things that we should be talking about will get talked about in any serious way in this election. So, having said that, we do have to talk a little bit about what are we going to do going forward and how are we going to cope with the counterweights issue. My argument in a nutshell is that we have to do something we figured out back in the 1980s, which is recognize that the leverage that we have in the world doesn't come out of our kind of larger global positionality. We don't get leverage out of saying to the Americans, we are going to exit from this relationship, and that threat of exit gives us leverage in our dealings with you. And we also don't have leverage out of we found a bunch of all other small and medium-sized powers, and they're all on the same team, and we're all going to collectively put pressure on you to behave differently. The only way that you get any genuine traction is in Washington is recognize that it is a big, complicated universe with many players, figure out where the weight is there and which directions those weights are pushing in, and then figure out ways to align yourselves with and to support the groups that are pushing in the direction that Canada is favored by. And that's something we figured out back in the 1980s, and we kind of jumped into that with both feet, and we never really lost sight of it. We still get that. There are lots of people in Ottawa who understand that's how this stuff works. But we do need to kind of embrace that, I guess, and we also need to recognize that we don't have a way to exercise some version of that in our relationships with Russia and China. Their systems don't work that way. There is no way to kind of crowbar your way into the system and line up with particular actors inside of those countries in order to get leverage. And so if we're going to have any way of dealing with them, we need to figure out ways to do it in combination with other Western states, and that is going to be about using our advantages by being more motivated, more engaged on particular issues, and by having the right transnational allies, not only in the UN, but not only in the US, but also in international organizations and other Western countries where we have traditional and established relationships and subnational partners. Okay.
Thank you. Excellent. Thank you. So listening, I'm beginning to understand why politicians do not want to put foreign policy on the agenda. Right? It is just complicated and difficult, and we don't even have to mention Brexit to get to that, right? But I want to use that to say just very quickly, following up from what Brian was saying, that he predicts that the way the election will play out, it will be like always, there won't be much talk about foreign policy. Does that matter for the foreign policy that we get?
I agree broadly with Brian. Pocketbook issues are generally the main issues in our elections. Geopolitics are almost never the themes in our elections. It's a reflection of what the electorate is wanting to talk about and to hear, and run through calculations and filters about what's likely to mobilize people to vote. And that is in some ways unfortunate, because we have a very big question in front of us, which is how as a country do we cope with this changed environment. One of the reasons also that we're unlikely to get a real in-depth discussion about this is that there are significant differences between what we've seen so far in the Liberal and the Conservative position, but both parties still essentially buy into the kind of post-war internationalism that emerged during a period of Pax Americana, and have only begun to adjust that for the new circumstances. They have not done the real hard thinking of what these changes mean for Canada. We saw a bit of it from Chrystia Freeland in her very good speech in Parliament in 2017. But a lot more needs to be done. And as I said before, I don't think the political parties are really equipped. They're equipped to do a lot of things, but they're not necessarily equipped to do that. So I think that we need to be realistic about our expectations about how much we'll hear about foreign policy. By all means, as citizens, we should be asking questions. But I think that there is a much longer and more in-depth and less gotcha style of discussion that we're going to need. And frankly, it's a largely bipartisan discussion too.
Well, one of the things that was clear when we had the first part of this debate in June with the foreign spokesperson from all the four federal parties was the differences, as you were saying, Roland, between them was really quite small. There were issue-specific differences, but by and large, it's the support for the liberal world order as it is. What I'm hearing from you guys, though, is a mix between a desire to put things back to the way they were in the good old days, and a realization that there has to be reform, that some things have to be radically changed, and we can't simply put things back together again. So I would like to ask you to be more specific about what are the reforms that are needed for for the international system and Canada's position within it to work better? Because all of you have hinted at this, but not elaborated very much. I don't know if anyone would like to pick up.
Well, if you take, for example, the tension on the trade side between the US and China, one could say that part of the sentiment in the US is that China has taken all the advantage of trade liberalization, but not necessarily played fair game when it came to some of the obligations that come with having open trade and things like that. It's true, not true, partially true. Other countries have been accused of the same thing before, including probably the US and others. But I think that what is the solution? Is the solution to turn back on yourself and say we're going to go to the good old days, knowing what's going to be the impact, which is we're all going to get approach to it? Or do you try to work at the WTO to try to make sure that there is a better way to ensure compliance to the norms, better behaviors, build coalitions of countries that are going to be able to put more pressure on China to behave better in that fashion. So I think that this is, to some extent, the current tension is a good example of a multilateral institution that maybe was not performing to the best. So a perception that wasn't bringing the plain level feel that you'd like to see on the trade side. And what do you do about it? You try to improve it, make it better, correct some of the problems, or you just withdraw. And I think that there's tremendous risk in withdrawing, and you would hope that people would invest in making the institution better.
Pascal, from the point of view of a China expert, how does one do that?
I'll take just a higher high-level approach to answering your question. I think that the world order is in such flux that we can't anymore afford to speak about it in binary terms. The same reflex we have to think about China good or bad. We can't really speak of the world order as something we either want to keep or reform. It's too complicated and it's changing at different levels. And so I think that part of the ground homework that we have to do is to be clear about what we mean and which parts of the global order we want to preserve, which parts we think are needed to be reformed, and which parts we think are not created, are not there yet, and then why we want to do these things. And I don't hear that enough. And so I think that from the perspective of China or developing countries, sometimes there's a confusion between, or it's not their confusion, it's actually, I think, we are confusing in the way that we speak about this. Because we come across at once as confusing interest and principles sometimes. And I think we have to be clear about the parts of the global order that we truly and genuinely believe are in the common good, common universal interest of humankind and are deserve to be preserved and defended. And the parts of the global order that are actually a manifestation of power relations that were established in the second half of the 20th century and that have not really adapted to the 21st century. And we don't have time to delve into too much detail, but an example that jumps to mind recently is the fact that the World Bank president is an American citizen and the head of the IMF is a European citizen. And maybe this is the kind of thing that Canada could kind of stand up and say, not really. That's not really about the common good. That's really about power. One example.
Brian, do you want to jump in?
I don't want to get in the way of that. Yes. I mean, it's funny actually. When you first brought up the question of reform, I wasn't sure which of two kinds of reform you had in mind. So one thing is reform of international institutions that we think are important. Another way of thinking about it is reform within Canada in terms of either reform of state structures or reform of sort of the way that the debate itself plays itself out, the media debate, the election process, those kinds of things. And I think I don't have a good solution to offer, but I do think there is a core problem that is remaining unresolved, and that is there still isn't a reliable mechanism in place to make the connection between the kind of pocketbook or neighborhood issues that Roland said, these are the things that people care about day to day and that they're going to focus on in the election, and these larger global issues. And we all know implicitly that those things are very tightly connected, and particularly in the last 30 or 40 years. There is this very stark separation between what we think of as foreign policy issues and what we think about as kind of local issues or domestic issues. And those that we all talk over and over again about that barrier doesn't make, or that separation doesn't make sense. Those things are clearly tied together. But there isn't any kind of meaningful mechanism in place in order to kind of convey that to voters when they're thinking about these issues in the election. There are things out there that, like think tanks and the media, there are things out there that you would expect would engage with these things, and part of their job is explaining the world to people, but the work isn't being done, and clearly in an effective way, because there still is this clear separation in people's minds about these two different categories of issues.
I'll take one comment from Roland.
Well, I think that's right, and it's partly a function of whether our political leaders have the skill to be able to articulate the importance of international affairs in terms that make sense. If you go door knocking, which I've never done before, but I presume that if you go door knocking, you get to the front door and you start talking about the liberal world order, it might work in Ottawa Centre, but nowhere else in the country, where people's eyes will glaze over, liberal world order. So it is partly the skill of politicians in being able to make that connection, and it's also the recipient. And there's a literacy issue here as well. And we're not a worldly country. We're extremely multicultural, but that's not the same as being worldly. The government has announced that it's going to, initiate a pilot to have Canadian students go abroad more and to non-traditional destinations. All of our peer countries are doing that in a big way because it's a strategic interest for them to have those connections and understandings of different parts of the world. But that's a generational project.
We're going to move to some questions from the audience, but just to say, isn't it partly the success of many populist parties in Europe that have managed to get electoral success, that they have precisely mobilized against globalization, which is a foreign policy issue that have been domesticated very effectively to electoral success?
Yeah, and you could say, not so much in Canada, but elsewhere, the same challenge that we have, what is the language to describe why it matters on Main Street for the liberal world order. The very idea of defending liberalism is difficult when it itself is under such enormous challenge in some of these other countries. And Gavin Gopnik's recent book, is one example of somebody trying to translate liberalism into something that makes sense. Our defense of liberalism is itself under threat. We need to be rethinking that too.
We're going to move to some questions from the audience. Caroline here has a microphone, so what you need to do is to exercise your arms like this, and she will come running, and we will take them. I see one here, Caroline. As you ask your question, may I ask you please to identify yourself and be relatively brief. Caroline here, Jeffrey Simpson there first. In the aisle in the middle. So you may need to just keep your arms up. No. Get that man.
I'm Jeff Simpson. I'm a senior fellow here. I covered innumerable election campaigns. I could not agree more with Roland Paris's comment that you can knock on 1,000 doors and say, I'm here to defend the liberal international order, and the door will either slam or something will happen. So let me be more specific. We have an election campaign. So let me ask you about two issue specifics. If you were the conservative foreign policy advisor, would you say to Mr. Scheer, attack the liberals for their ineptitude at the United Nations because we're going to lose the Security Council race against Norway. And we're going to lose it because their gender policy goes over flat almost everywhere in the world. Canada isn't back. We haven't increased our aid budget. We've wimped out on peacekeeping, etc. Let's cut our losses that the Liberals are going to lead us to a smashing defeat. And if you were the Liberals, would you do a reprise of Joe Clark, who you may remember promised to move the Canadian Embassy at one point from one place to another, lost a lot of support, and why don't the Liberals go after the Conservatives for just that, as following Donald Trump's lead in moving the embassy from one to the other? It was a loser back in 1979, and it's probably a loser now. There's two issues. Your advisors, give them good advice.
Thank you.
Always good to have a journalist.
Who wants to have a go at giving advice based on that question?
My answer is that for 98% of the audiences they're going to speak to, I would not give that advice, but I would go really hard on both of those two things for specific micro audiences that really care about that stuff. And that is the way to start. There are some Canadians who care a lot and are quite knowledgeable about Canadian foreign policy. And the parties do speak to them from time to time, but always in this kind of like micro-messaging way. And it's irrelevant to the bigger swing of the election.
I'm not going to answer this question directly. I've managed to stay out of politics for 35 years, so I'll stay out of this one. But I actually think that I agree with everything that has been said, that foreign policy is not going to be part of an election. If there is an element of foreign policy, and a very important one that I mentioned, that is probably going to have some play, is the issue of climate change. I think you have most parties, recognizing the fact that there is an issue there, that something needs to be done, proposing different methods. But I think that when you look at both polling, public sentiment, it's an issue that Canadians care more and more. So while it may not be a pocketbook issue, or at least some may try to present it, like when you have the debate over whether you're going to have gas tax or whatever. But I actually think this is an area where the interest within the public is more and more. That's probably also my opportunity to say that the reason to a foreign policy, I think where you've all made a case for having a foreign policy review, going outside of the department, the people, the various departments involved, not only to draw on the talent that is outside, but it's to precisely engage the public on those issues more. I think that countries that do these things well, Australia is a country that comes to mind, do a very good job of using these reviews to engage the public on these very difficult issues.
Well, I'm surprisingly not going to offer political advice to the leader of the Conservative Party. But I would say that although foreign policy is unlikely to feature much in this election, stuff does happen from time to time, events. Alan Kurdi, the deceased baby on the beach, became a significant shift in the discourse of the last election. And on top of that, foreign policy is always, Jeff, as you know better than anyone, it's a proxy for leadership. And so I suspect, based on what the leaders have said so far, that, and previous campaigns, that it will continue to be a proxy for leadership, and they're not going to jump on something like the UN Security Council campaign, which frankly at the front door probably has the same impact as the liberal world order. I think that what you've seen from Andrew Scheer is trying to use foreign policy as a wedge to portray Trudeau as naive or weak, whether it's caving into Trump on NAFTA, which is, I think, a false charge, or failing to stand up to China. And for Trudeau, it'll be similarly a symbol of how he approaches cooperation and collective leadership as opposed to the quote-unquote politics of division. And so it'll all reverberate back into a domestic political message. Anyway, that's my hunch.
Just to jump in before we take the next question, since Danielle has mentioned climate change, our last in this series is on climate change. So I think that's a very important issue that clearly will play out. Caroline, there was a question here, and unless you have something right there. Yes, please go ahead.
Good evening to everyone. My name is Gombela Tofik from Ghana, and I want to ask a very a question everyone is familiar with. It's about Brexit. In the likely event that Brexit happens, in what strategic ways can Canada or will Canada be able to craft foreign policies in terms of trade with Great Britain in a way that will involve provincial government in that regard?
Thank you. The Brexit question. Does anyone, Roland?
Only to say that Canada, it's a good question, that Canada clearly has an interest in, and there is a bit of a difference between the party leaders on this, but even that slight difference wouldn't change the fact that Canada has an interest in having excellent relations with Britain and excellent relations with the European Union. And personally, it's a disaster. You know, I think it's a disaster in so many different ways. In terms of the trade relationship, we have negotiated a free trade agreement with the EU, which I think is excellent. It's in fact what Pierre Trudeau, I think, was thinking about when he was thinking about diversifying trade. We got that in place. And there's no reason why Canada and Britain couldn't continue to have very, very close trade relations. There were negotiations taking place over a possible UK-Canada trade agreement. Of course, this is all notional because the real negotiations couldn't happen until Britain's not part of the EU. And the model for that negotiation was that Canada would essentially apply, that the two countries would apply the framework of the CETA agreement with the EU to the Canada-UK relationship. But then all of a sudden, the UK announced that it was going to, in the event of Brexit, eliminate import tariffs as a way of reassuring their own domestic markets about what the impact of Brexit might be. Well, if you're in a negotiation and suddenly the other side says, you know, you can have it all. Now, what are you going to give? What do you say? You say, I've got a call I've got to take right now. You shouldn't expect me back at the negotiating table anytime soon. That's what happened.
Can I just add on to that? For further reading, Rita mentioned that I'm the editor of International Journal. We have another issue coming out in a week, and in that there's a short piece by a guy named Achim Hurlman. He's a professor at another nearby university. Yes, and it's like 5 or 6 pages specifically on that question. So,
As with so many things with Brexit, it's all in flux, right? Caroline, where are you going next?
I have one here, one
Okay.
here copy, and then I'll add another loop.
Okay, so
Thank you. My name is John Curtis. I was referred to by Roland before. I'd have to say I have no fixed address. In other words, a former public servant having been part of many of these trade negotiations and some of the international monetary side of things as well. I'll make 2 points. It's a very complex area, a very interesting discussion we've heard today, but 2 points that haven't been highlighted. One, although Roland pointed us in that direction, one is to remember that Canada is relatively small. Where we lead is intellectual thought and ideas. And this is, I think, a real challenge both for the political parties now, for the general public, for a possible commission. We won't call it any longer a Royal Commission on Foreign Policy, but some kind of commission of inquiry, which I would argue also we need for the economy as we look ahead. But we really need to exercise intellectual leadership. That's where Canada will make a difference. And that hasn't come up as clearly as I'd like to hear. Secondly, governments aren't the whole story in foreign policy. Corporations, organized groups, organized power, this is all part of what the public is interested in as we look ahead. How do we deal with Google? That's partly a foreign policy issue, but it's also a domestic issue, a prosperity issue. It affects every individual going onto Gmail day by day. I think we have to engage all sectors of society as we go forward and not worry only about what government X, foreign government Y is doing. It really is a much broader story than we've heard today. Thanks.
So do we take that as a comment that does anyone want to follow up? It's a complex issue, and Canada is an intellectual leader in the world. I wonder, for example, Pascal, in relation to China, that might be a complex issue. You spoke about the need for pragmatism, but Canada is also often known for its leadership being based on values, and there might be a clash there, that intellectual leadership is a value-based leadership.
Yes. Absolutely. It was a very good intervention, and I'm likely to take it as a comment. But of course, I think that we have to evolve a little bit from a tendency to broadcast our values internationally and into an era where we can think a little bit more in almost a realist term sense about our relationships with various countries, China included. It doesn't mean that it's a direction that will be valueless and non-principled, but the megaphone approach will clearly not work.
Hello, my name is Samuel Fleming. I just be a student here. My question is relating to China. You mentioned that there's issues that we must leave to the Chinese, and some that we may intervene or engage them with, and some that we have to, all what you said. But I was wondering, where would you classify the issues concerning the South China Sea, the threats made to Taiwan, and the way that the Uyghurs are being treated right now, and how can Canada intervene on these issues without hurting too much its relations with China, or should we intervene, or how? And also, how can we criticize China and try to be their friend at the same time, knowing how they're not fond of criticism whatsoever at any time, and that they have vitriolic responses to it and to any thing concerning their national sovereignty or what they perceive it to be?
Yeah, so I would ideally have more than 2 minutes to answer that question. But definitely some of the issues you mentioned. So there are kind of two categories, I think. The first part of your question, where would you put the kind of hard security questions, and then where would you put the human rights violations questions? In the four categories that I outlined, I think clearly the human rights violations questions I put in category 5, which is challenge and engage, which I call challenge and engage, because I think that they're not very effectively dealt with in the confines of a bilateral relationship. They can be dealt with a little bit, but not very effectively, and certainly not within the confines of a relationship that's not working right now. But they are complex issues. It's hard for us sometimes, I think, to understand how difficult it is to influence a very big country to change domestic ways of doing things. And sometimes I think that we also don't have a claim, and some other times I think there are actually claims to be made. It's just really difficult. We have to maybe think of other large countries that do things that we really profoundly disagree with or thought were egregious, and how we would have gone on trying to convince them to do otherwise. It's really not that clear that Canada alone can make any big country change its mind about much. So we have to accept that to some extent, but that doesn't mean that we can't do anything. And on all sorts of questions, there are multilateral forums where we can act, and also the current government has tried a little bit with the detention of the two Michaels and the Vienna Convention to garner a little bit of interest internationally and support from other countries, and so that's also an approach that can be effective. So I
would say, and Pascal covered it in her intervention, her initial intervention. When you're dealing with these issues on China, you really have to build a coalition of people that will be prepared to go with the kind of same message, tough message, and it's because of the geo-economic weight that China now carries. I can tell you, if I haven't been there, it's a lot more difficult than what it might be in the past. But if you don't do that, then you're exposed. That's exactly what she said earlier. It's a little bit what Vana was saying about the Saudi Arabia issue. So somehow you have to rally support among your likely-minded that it is not in our mutual interest nor in our individual interest to lower our reaction to things that are egregious, whether it's territorial infringements or very serious human rights violations, detentions, to try to interfere into an issue like what we see. Now, if you're alone, you can do all the noise that you want. Even a big country would have a tough time acting alone. Can you imagine with the relative weight that Canada is? So I think that's where we need to go. I mean, the one area where I really enjoyed the presentation of Pascal at the beginning, the one area where I see challenging in what she proposed is to take an approach like the one we've taken with the United States, which is our approach in the United States, when we mature it in the 2000, I was in Washington at the time, I worked a lot on that, is to really leverage American interests who have a keen interest in working with us because of the interdependence between the two countries. It's very difficult to replicate something like that in China, with a regime like China. Which is why it brings me back to somehow you need to build a coalition of countries that are prepared to go at the same message, same tone. And I can tell you from having lots of conversations among G7 and NSA's equivalent, it's tough at times because people look at their own kind of personal interests. So.
Can I respond to this? It's really interesting. I thought when I mentioned the US that somebody would pick up on this. I don't, when I say that we have to leverage or learn from our experience, especially our recent NAFTA experience, and apply some of those lessons to China, I don't mean that the relationships are similar or that we should approach them similarly. What I do think, though, is that China is not a unitary bloc either, and that we would gain leverage if we were to recognize entry points. So it's true, as Brian said, that we can't access the Chinese system like we do the US system. But on things like protection of IP, it would serve Canadian interests to be aware of the large Chinese companies that are actually on our side with us, on this, and try to develop relationships outside of the, government-to-government bilateral relationship. And so we have to be able to start parsing out the curtain of the Chinese system and dealing a little bit more nimbly with the parts that form the whole.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the broad point that I draw out of this discussion is that we need to be smart and selective in how we are raising some of these issues. And being smart is partly recognizing that we have very little direct leverage over China. To the extent that we have leverage, it's in combination with other countries. So questioner Samuel mentioned the Uyghurs. One of the things that John McCallum did do when he was in China was rally a whole bunch of mainly Western ambassadors to send a letter, I think it was to the, I don't know which official he sent it to, but to a senior official in the Chinese government, asking for an explanation of what was going on in Xinjiang with the detention camps. And that was smart in my view, because it did rise to the level of something that looked like an extraordinary violation of human rights. But it wasn't just Canada sticking its head up above the parapet going and receiving, and getting picked off like we were with Saudi Arabia. And the same, the Uyghur issue was again raised by a number of countries through UN Geneva, I think 19 countries. Again, Canada was together with other countries. So that's part of being smart and being selective, because as much as we will try, as I'm sure no matter who is in power in this country is going to try hard to try and sustain the kind of liberal world order that we have in place, it is eroding, and we do have to be thinking about how to manage in a meaner world where others are going to be not looking out for our interests.
One more question. Thank you.
Bonjour, je vais la poser en français si c'est correct. Une question aussi sur la Chine, en fait, pour rebondir sur la nomination diplomatique. Comme vous avez dit, ça a surpris beaucoup de gens que ça soit fait avant les élections. Donc, pourquoi, selon vous, ça s'est passé avant les élections? Est-ce que c'est un message adressé aux Chinois pour voir s'il allait avoir de la réciprocité? Est-ce que c'est un message envoyé à Ottawa pour dire qu'on gère la situation? Est-ce que c'est un move un peu plus électoral pour envoyer un message justement aux Canadiens que la situation est prise en charge? Donc, un peu comment vous interprétez cette nomination diplomatique. Est-ce que ça a aussi rapport au caractère unanime de la personne qui a été désignée?
Merci. Ça, c'est à toi.
Oui. Vous nommez énormément d'éléments, je pense, qui formeraient ma réponse dans votre question. Donc, c'est une très bonne question. Je pense que, effectivement, c'était surprenant parce qu'on ne s'attendait pas à ce qu'une nomination soit effectuée avant la campagne pour plusieurs raisons. Entre autres parce que la relation allait si mal, elle va encore mal. La relation va si mal qu'on ne s'attendait pas à ce que l'agrément soit reçu par la Chine et avant les élections, avant que la Chine ne sache quel parti allait former le gouvernement. Maintenant, vous mentionnez aussi dans votre question la personne de Vladimir Putin. Je pense que la personne fait une différence, effectivement. Il a un passé très unique, puis il a une capacité d'agir qui va au-delà de ses relations avec le parti au pouvoir en ce moment. Et ce que je dirais aussi, c'est que la nomination était à la fois, effectivement, une opportunité. C'est à la fois une opportunité pour le Canada, puis un signal que, je dirais de deux façons, un signal que la Chine est possiblement prête à commencer à normaliser l'état des choses et à cesser l'escalation. C'est pas certain, mais c'est un signal, c'est peut-être dans le monde des possibles. Et c'est aussi... et on devra s'attendre en retour à ce qu'il nomme un ambassadeur dans les jours qui vont, les semaines qui vont venir.
Daniel?
Pascal a répondu à une partie de votre question dans le sens où s'il y a une nomination d'ambassadeur, ça veut dire qu'il y a eu un agrément de côté et d'autre pour la nomination d'un ambassadeur. Donc, il y avait une entente qui avait une nomination d'ambassadeur des deux côtés. Il faut espérer qu'effectivement, moi je ne suis pas dans les dessous de ces discussions-là de nos jours, il faut espérer qu'effectivement c'est parce que même si la relation va très mal, comme Pascal l'a dit, il y a un intérêt à vouloir regarder la relation long terme et de vouloir nommer des émissaires. Ça, c'est, je dirais, le côté positif de regarder cette décision-là. Il faut juste espérer que ce n'était pas juste parce que ça se donnait que peut-être le mandat de l'ambassadeur chinois achevait, puis que ça donnait un bon moment pour faire. Je pense pas. Quand c'est fait juste avant l'élection, j'ose croire que c'est parce qu'il y a une ouverture à ce que, même si les problèmes demeurent, c'est des questions qui vont être très difficiles à régler, celles auxquelles on fait face, il y a une ouverture à vouloir au moins regarder le long terme, avoir une relation, essayer de voir comment on peut gérer ces irritants-là dans la relation présentement. Et pour faire ça, d'avoir un ambassadeur de part et d'autre est une bonne chose.
Dernière question, s'il vous plaît. There's one right at the front here, please.
So sorry for... Oh, no, that's okay.
Hi, I'm also a Gypsy student. My name's Natasha. Just a question to reflect on what's going on with the Hong Kong protests and then protests happening on campus. As we are on an international university campus, it's recognized across the world. So what would you recommend to us students who are potentially engaging in ideologically based conversations around what China is doing, and do you think the federal government would act on it, kind of like how the Australian government is acting on investigating what's going on their university campuses when it comes to students kind of engaging over ideological based arguments?
Great, thank you, Natasha. Who would like to start on that question, which I think we could reflect on more broadly as well in terms of student engagement in politics, protest around electoral issues. Right?
Okay. I mean, to my mind, there are two separate things that are both important to talk about. So one of them is thinking about the question of foreign interference in or intervention in local debates on campus and in other places in the community. And that's something that we have thought about as something where there have been efforts to sort of influence Canadian debates on various policy issues via the internet, but there are also people who are more directly and concretely involving themselves, and then some of them have connections to foreign government. So that's one set of issues, and then there's another set of issues about students wanting to involve themselves in foreign policy decisions, and obviously those things are tied up in a particularly interesting and challenging way on this particular issue, and not necessarily for other things. I don't know enough about this. I mean, like most people, sort of just starting to kind of understand what's going on some of these issues. I don't know if anybody wants to take the ball from me.
Does it have? I shall do that. I shall do that.
Okay.
It's a really good question. And from the very beginning of the movement this year and the earlier events that happened in Australia and New Zealand, I immediately thought that one of the first tasks that universities have to do across Canada is make sure that we refresh, revitalize, revisit our rules for the preservation of safe spaces and student engagement in really hot issues on campuses. And I don't know that we do that very well, and I think we wait for problems to arise and then we kind of try to deal with them. And I think this is one instance where it's a really great opportunity for universities to sit down and say, okay, how do we handle events where different parts of the student population may have really, really deeply held differences of beliefs or opinions on things, and how do we protect their spaces for every student's space for expressing he or herself. So we need to do that. I think that it's really interesting how events in China force us to think about how we view our life in Canada. It's so interesting, right? And it happens in this case. It would also happen, I would argue, in the case of researchers that collaborate with China, and so there are issues that are arising around this, and I think that, frankly, we would need to sit around and perhaps have ethical boards sit down and think deeply about the kinds of issues that are raised before these topics become inflamed and dealt with in unelegant ways. We should be ahead of the curve on this, and I'm not sure that we do that enough. So I hope if protests happen at the University of Ottawa, that we're well prepared to be respectful and handle this in the most civilized manner that we can.
In a way, your question has given us a concrete instance of the connectedness of foreign policy and domestic policy and university policy, local policy. I'm going to invite our four panelists to add whatever final comments they would like to add, and can't maybe address the question, but otherwise anything that you would like to add to the debate before we finish up. Roland?
Well, I just had in mind the discussion we're just having, and I don't think it's surprising to us, three professors in a row, what is their attitude? Their attitude is, protect free speech. And, it's essential in a university space to continue to reaffirm the importance of not getting freaked out by people who have different views, and even people who are expressing them in unpleasant ways. This is what we really protect in a university space. And that means, though, that people who are expressing their views also have to allow other people to express their views. More generally, I'm struck by the number of questions about China so far tonight. And to come back to something I think that Pascal was getting at, about the need for us to think in a more nuanced way about this country. We've never had to deal with a country like this before, which is not just an emerging great power, it is a major power, and it is simultaneously a partner and an adversary. Simultaneously. It is not the full spectrum adversary of the Soviet Union during the Cold War, nor is it simply a partner. And I like the approach. I was trying to make quick notes, and I'll look back at your paper about the 4 categories, but the impulse is the important one. The idea that there are some areas where we have to be able to behave differently. Can we do that? Maybe. It's going to be tough. It requires a balanced policy, and it's going to be even harder if, as we're seeing, our principal trading partner, where 76% of our exports go, as opposed to the 6% that go to China, our principal trading partner is veering towards a kind of disengagement.
Daniel, do you want to add?
On the first question, I would only second what I've said. I think even as a practitioner, if there's one thing that you want to see in universities, in think tanks, you want to see respectful debate. As someone who was serving in Hong Kong from 1988 to 1990, I have to tell you that I'm watching what's happening in Hong Kong with interest, and just hope that somehow, through some form of resolution, things can get better there, because I've seen if they don't go well, what can happen. In relation to China, I think what is unfortunate with what's happened in the last year, with the tension, and we all know why there's that tension, is we had managed in the last few years to establish, through my position, what we call the National Security Dialogue, but it's a comprehensive way of engaging in strategic dialogue with China on a number of issues. And it also means that your engagement with China is with very senior people in the parties, not only the Foreign Affairs Department, which has in many, as in most countries, has its limits when it comes to influence on the government. So it has allowed us to discuss some of the very difficult issues that were raised today, whether it was theft of intellectual property, cyber espionage, human rights, and things like that. Was it difficult conversation? Of course, these conversations are going to be difficult because we spoke about different values. But at least there was a channel, a process to do this, and I suspect that it's going to be a lot more difficult for the people who succeed me to have these kinds of conversations right now. And that's part of the reason why somehow we need to focus on the long game in China, the strategic interests, our strategic interests, their strategic interests, and somehow let the time and whatever events are going to happen deal with the current irritants. We cannot let it drive the whole of the relationship.
Thank you. Brian, 2 minutes?
Yeah.
Quickly.
Okay. Yes, absolutely. How many people here are graduate students? Okay. This is, my 2 minutes is mostly aimed at you, but other people may or may not find it interesting. I want to kind of flag that there is another problem to lay on top of all this stuff. So that we've talked quite a bit about how the world gets much more complicated, but we don't seem to be talking enough about it in our sort of actual political process. And when we are talking about it, we're not talking about it in a way that's nearly complicated or sophisticated enough. Adding on to that, the one additional problem is the problem of the relationship between academics and policymakers when it comes to foreign policy in general. Stepping back from the sort of long history of that, my perception of it is that back in the sort of Cold War, through most of the Cold War, academics knew a bit about the world, but and they did a lot of essentially trying to give advice to government, but that advice was often fairly shallow, at least in terms of technical detail. But what academics were pretty good at back then was being a pain in the ass to government and saying, you're doing it wrong, and here are the reasons why I think you're doing it wrong, and you want to do these things better. And my sense is that over time, academic research on foreign policy in Canada has gotten much more technically sophisticated. People know a lot more about the policy details in particular faraway places that we didn't understand in any depth before. And the policy issues themselves have become more complicated, and then academic experts have kind of burrowed down deeper into particular issues and become deep experts on particular things. And the government has kind of incentivized that by giving funding to people who are going to study those kind of deeply burrowed questions. And more that funding is sort of at least seen to be kind of conditional. If you are being useful by providing government with technical understanding that it wouldn't otherwise be able to generate in-house, then you're going to keep getting more money and more support and more access and all of those kinds of things. And being a pain in the ass might complicate that, so you might or might not want to avoid it, especially if you're not very far along in your career. And so my sense is that the technical sophistication and the helpfulness has gone steadily up, but the pain in the ass has gone steadily down. And I think that's a problem. I do worry about that in the longer term, and so I put that in front of you for the grad students as something to think about and to worry about going forward. If you're going to pursue an academic track, you want to think about what kind of academic you're going to be and what kind of relationship you want to have with the levers of power and with other academics and how you're going to manage those things.
Thank you.
Sure.
Let's go, final words.
This feels like the end.
You can be right in the back if you want to.
No, so I'm just taking up on Roland's noticing that there are a lot of questions on China, which makes me very happy because I think we need to speak more about it. Now, I think on the one hand, the likelihood that this becomes more of a campaign issue is a good thing just because we need more discussion, but on the other hand, I don't think that the campaign is the best context to develop nuanced, complex, the policy dialogues on China. And I am a little bit concerned that the dynamic of an electoral campaign draws leaders across the spectrum to more extreme views that they would otherwise take in power. However, I think that there's kind of an allowance for that. US politics has led to that kind of dynamic, and then leaders have retreated to more middle-of-the-road positions, and so this may happen here too. I would just end by saying that there was one particular poll that was conducted already 2 or 3 years ago, that instead of asking Canadians, do you agree or disagree with this, or do you like or dislike China, they asked, do you agree, disagree, or are you not sure? And the not sure proportion was about 50%. And so I think that I was very hopeful in seeing this because we're at the beginning of a period of a new era, right, in the 21st century with a very present China in our lives. And so I think there's a lot of debates, place still for debate and dialogue and the formation of sophisticated policy approaches towards China and Canada.
Thank you. So before I ask you to join me in thanking the panelists, and before I thank you for coming out and asking all these brilliant questions, let me just say a couple of things. I think this is the beginning of a conversation that will last for 4 weeks at CIPS. Next week, we focus in on a more specific issue of security and defense policy and what that means for Canada and going forward with the election. The following week, we ask the question, is Canada still a good international citizen? With the assumption that it was, and maybe still is. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the final panel in this series is focused entirely on climate change and environment. So please do come back. Do ask all those brilliant questions again next time. I think we've learned a lot today. We've learned that we should be more of a pain in the back. We've learned that we should think more nuanced, flexibly, and possibly more pragmatically about foreign policy, and that we should talk about it. So I would like to thank you a lot, very much, for coming out, for asking your questions, for being here. I would like to ask our panelists for kicking us off to such a good start and tackling so many extremely difficult issues with such great clarity. So thank you all and have a lovely evening.